All right, so this video will be focused on the orders of amphibians, the Lissamphibia, which is the extant group of amphibians that is left. There were others, but this is what's left, Lissamphibia. So Lissamphibia and Amphibia are basically the same thing. We selected some orders and families that are represent the diversity that's out there, especially that are in Rhode Island. But a lot of these actually are not in Rhode Island. Some of these are not in Rhode Island, but most of them are. So I'll start here with the Gymnophiona. These are the Sicilians. These are very. This is an example of a group that has no limbs. So you see the loss of limbs in quite a few different vertebrate lines independently. So you can think of the evolution of limbs. The first amniotes that crawled up out of the water and moved around on land and were sort of semi-aquatic. At some point, we have full tetrapods, and then you have the loss of limbs, which is pretty remarkable. In fact, the amphibians actually are a group of not amniotes, but early land vertebrates that did go back more toward a water-dependent lifestyle in an evolutionary sense. So the Gymnophiona or the Sicilians is something that we're not going to be familiar with here in Rhode Island, but they are sort of snake-like, snake-like amphibian, have no limbs. And we'll look at these in lecture in more detail. But one of the really interesting characteristics of them is they have maternal care to the extent that the youngsters even eat the skin of the mother, which is really odd. So let's take a look at the order Urodela. These are the salamanders. So the lizard-like appearance. I think when you see a salamander, no matter what it is, you automatically recognize that as a salamander, just like anybody who sees a frog recognizes it as a frog. Limbs are very short. Only in rare cases do you have big limbs. Sometimes the limbs are so small, they don't even hardly look functional. But in fact, they are, and they can get away from you pretty fast despite being these cold little amphibians. So they can use those legs to good purpose. Actually, interestingly, the highest diversity of salamanders in the world is found in the United States, the southeastern United States, Appalachians, and other parts of the south, and then into the southeastern United States. They're so diverse that there are some species that are named after U.S. counties. And you could probably spend 4 year summers traveling, looking for and trying to catalog all the salamander diversity in southeastern United States and never actually get them all. Some are actually quite rare. So you see, as salamanders, the treasures of the Appalachians. They must have, that's just where they evolved and diversified, and then they, when the continents were all together, they spread throughout the world. Sirens. This is something, again, we're not going to be familiar with here in Rhode Island, but well, I don't want to say that for sure. But the lesser siren, but this is not something we're going to go out and find around here. These are kept as pets oftentimes. What's interesting about them is you have loss of limbs, but they're just the hind limbs, and also the loss of the pelvic girdles. We see that with snakes and lots of other vertebrate lines. The sirens, so easily sirenity. Then there's the plethodons. So the plethodons these are lungless, and so this is probably I think this is the most diverse family of salamanders. So if you think about the fact that they're lungless, then how do they perfuse their circulatory system with oxygen in exchange and release CO2? They don't have lungs. Well, it's going to tell you several things. One thing is they must be wet. So they are, because anytime a gas enters a tissue or comes from a tissue, it has to be dissolved in a fluid. Okay, so these salamanders, which are including the redback salamander, which is the most common, maybe the most abundant native vertebrate in eastern North America, they all have their skin is always moist, and it has to be. Now they don't have to be in water, But in dry, like the last summer, this summer in July and August were just incredibly dry. These redback salamanders went away. They were gone. You couldn't find them if you went out and looked for them in North Woods. They corkscrew themselves down into the soil until they get to some wet soil, and they just wait there and they just wait out the drought, which lasted over 2 months this year. Now they're out again. You can lift up a log and under leaf litter, you can find them pretty easily right now. And then the dusky salamander is another example of that, which is harder to find around here. Another thing about them, in addition to being wet, is they're small. So they have a high surface area to volume ratio, given the amount of the little cells in their body are never very far from the outside, which is where the source of oxygen is. Extremely diverse. Mud puppies. So this is something that I don't really, I don't have a lot of, haven't caught many of these in my life. But what's really interesting about, one of the interesting things about them is they maintain their juvenile stage of their lifestyle in terms of their external gills. These feathery gills, they keep them. Gills, by the way, are highly efficient at respiration. They're really nice to have. There's not a more efficient organ out there in terms of exchanging oxygen and CO2. The problem with them is that they're feathery and they're out there in the environment, in an aquatic environment, so they're very sensitive to all the bad things that can happen, whether chemical changes, temperature changes, being dried out, desiccated, and they are very, very much dependent on water. Not that they don't come out of water occasionally, but they pretty much have to be in water all the time. So it's called paedomorphosis, where they, instead of metamorphizing into the adult form, you think of, where they run around on land, they don't do that. They are dependent on water for their entire lives. And here's here's a video showing that, showing some of them here, an example of one here. You can see the gills, feathery gills. The problem with that is that what happens if your pond dries up? So these, they do disperse from pond to pond. So this is an example of trade-offs. So and oftentimes these ponds are ephemeral in terms of they do dry up occasionally, and they may have to move to another pond. But it's always very risky. Life is very risky for amphibians, because you lay your eggs in a pond, the pond could dry up. If you're paedomorphic, you live in a pond, that pond could dry up. On the other hand, those ponds can be very rich with resources. So there's a lot of research done on the evolution of paedomorphosis. Just because it's an interesting evolutionary trade-off. Paedomorphosis versus metamorphosis. There's advantages to maintaining the feathery gills throughout life, and there's disadvantages. Which one wins out in different environments? It's a way of studying evolution. Another common family is the Salamandridae. These have, so one example of this would be our red-spotted newt. So these are really common in New England and the eastern United States. They're brightly colored, and they do have poison cells. So this is one of the things about amphibians, is they evolved poison cells. They evolved glands. Glands are not that common among vertebrates. Mammals are famous for glands: mammary glands, scent glands, sebaceous glands. Amphibians also evolved glands, skin glands. And these are oftentimes exude toxins, which are produced metabolically. The skin is rough because what you're seeing here are those poison-producing cells. And of course, this is all about anti-predator adaptation. You won't mistake these for other salamanders because they don't have what's called a costal grooves. So this picture right here just shows what you mean by costal grooves. Costal mean like referring to your side, in the area where you expect your ribs to be. You notice these do not have that. And I'm sure this costal grooves is really associated with surface area as well, but they don't have that Salamandridae. Ambystoma. The Ambystoma genus of salamander is very common, including the spotted, which you can see here in the spring. when they come out to go to the ponds. And then the marble salamander, which I believe actually breeds in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, which is a funny thing. I have to check that, but I think I read that. I don't know much. I don't find many marble salamanders. I've only seen one in my whole time here in Rhode Island. I know some people can find them, but they have different. Their timing of the reproduction is quite different, but they're both in bistoma. They do have the costal grooves. Some of these are actually pretty popular pets, especially tiger salamanders, which aren't mentioned here. But they have this pretty much shiny skin, which is a reflection of they're moist, the fact that they stay moist. So they're not gonna be. This is not unlike toads. They're just not gonna let their skin dry out. And if they're in an environment where the skin could dry out, then they get out of there. But they do have lungs. But they also respire through their skin. Then there's the anurids. This is one of the most recognizable groups of vertebrates that there is. Anybody anywhere recognizes a frog. If you look at a frog, why do you recognize a frog as a frog? Well, look at the way they sit. They sit with their forelimbs propped up in front of them, and they have these enormous, generally disproportionately large hind limbs and a highly modified pelvic girdle, hip bones. So what they are is they are sprung. They're like a spring that is set to jump. And once they jump and they land and relax, get back in, they cock their spring again, and they're ready to jump again. This is all about getting away from predators. The great thing about getting away from predators with a jump is you startle the predator. There's that one moment where it's surprise, and then by that time the frog is, a couple of feet away from you, and then they jump again. So they're very hard to catch. The adults lose their tails. They start with tadpoles in the water, and then they lose those tails, and then they are no longer dependent on water. The urostyle, which we're going to look at in lecturing, you'll see in lab, the structure is the highly modified pelvic girdle. It's called a urostyle. And you can think about other things about frogs that make them unique. But notice here is that all of them have that same sort of body shape. Take a look at some of the families. The pipids. The pipids are most well known for two different things. One thing is you got the African clawed frog, which is a famous research model. So people that study cell membrane function use these for models because you can fertilize you can basically have them produce eggs and fertilize them, and they'll develop. And so you can do all kind of. They're just a great research model, and they're easy to raise and grow. They're also invasive. You'll look at a video that talks about that. And then the other thing they're famous for is this sort of, that some people find this horrifying, this reproduction that occurs when tadpoles hatch from the back of the male. The eggs are laid on the back of a male, and sometimes are actually, I should say, sometimes a female, depends on the species. And the eggs eventually burrow in basically lesions form, holes form, and the tadpoles develop in there and then burst out. So it's kind of a horrifying thing. There's some people actually have a real problem with this. I think it's just kind of gross. Anyway, first of all, let's look at the African clawed frog. Here they are. They're pretty popular pets, I think. Although I don't really know why. They're extremely slippery. They have these beady eyes. They don't actually look like your typical frog. Unfortunately, what's happened is they have been released into native waters, like in Washington here, in the United States. And I believe they're probably in Florida as well. And so they're going to be spreading in areas. And that's an unfortunate thing, since they're prolific in reproduction, and they can exclude the competition other native species. But they are important as a research model. Here's and then another pipid example here. We have the eggs laid on the back of an individual. This is really about protecting your eggs. This is kind of like maternal, this is parental care. Look at this. The skin develops these lesions. The eggs are basically absorbed. How long did that take to evolve? And then this happens. So this is pretty disturbing, I think, because you you think of your skin as protection, and you don't want things coming out of it, hatching out of it. But there it is. I think we typically associate things in our skin coming out as a very bad thing. So it's hard not to think of that. But what you have all the eggs confined, into a one individual that can move around and get away from predators. So you can see how this is an example of reducing predation risk on eggs. Because the problem with having eggs in the water is that there's a high risk of predation. There they are coming out. Pretty bizarre. The spadefoots, this is something I've actually never seen a spadefoot. They are a native species. Eastern spadefoot is a native species, and it's endangered. Why is it endangered? Because it depends on very special conditions of wetlands, ephemeral ponds, with habitat, which is pretty rare in Rhode Island because of development and agriculture, and also encroachment of forest over the years. We don't have the combination of habitats available for them, and their numbers became very small. So it's always hard to bring back a species when the numbers are low and there's not a lot of habitats. So there's been quite a bit of effort to bring them back here, including the Rhode Island DEM and the Roger Williams Zoo. There they are there. You can see the leaf litter there. So what's been happening is the creation of artificial wetlands that will be suitable for the spadefoot toad. And what you see here, that's Scott Buchanan. I believe he actually took this class as an undergraduate here. He's the DEM's main go-to person for amphibians. There's the ponds there. So basically, it doesn't look like much, right? But what you're seeing here is, open meadow. It's a special it's not forest. It's not all out in the open either. It's not exactly meadow. It's kind of a combination. And this is a sort of wetlands and meadow-like environments are really uncommon here. And so what they've done is they sort of try to speed up the recovery by digging out these wetlands, creating them artificially, and then hoping that the population takes hold there. This is a project actually you could be part of if you like. If you look up the DEM and spadefoot toad and Roger Williams Zoo, they oftentimes need volunteers to do various aspects of the research. Spadefoot, look at that. So these are diggers. Not that, lots of frogs dig, but that is an adaptation there, a digging adaptation. By the way, webbing is pretty ancestral, I think, the webbing, on the digits of a vertebrate. Here we have a digging foot, so the name for it. Buphonidae, this is another highly recognizable vertebrate. I think most people recognize a toad when they see it. And what do you think? Why do you recognize? Why is that a toad and not a frog? How do you tell them? Toad frog is probably not a real. When you say toad, you really mean it's a Buphonidae. But it gets a little iffy when you're talking about like spadefoot toad and narrow-mouthed toad. So taxonomically, toad versus frog is not correct. It's not valid. But the Buphonidae, those are recognizable toads. They have dry skin and the skin glands that you can actually see visibly when you look at them. So, if your dog, a young dog, ever catches a toad and like, what is this? And sort of tries to bite into it or mouth it, they get a secretion of a highly, not deadly, but a very noxious fluid, and it'll cause them to salivate and sometimes even vomit. So they learned their lesson that when I was a kid, our dog did that in Missouri. American toad, Woodhouse's toad, these are the two that are most common here in Rhode Island, but the American toad is the most common one throughout North America. But they're the parotid glands. They're hard to distinguish between each other, but you can look up how to do that. And hopefully, this is something we didn't actually catch. I don't believe we caught this year with the Tuesday section. But this is something you will see. They breed in the spring, and they have these little tiny black strings of eggs, and they're pretty loud, usually in June. Hylids, these are really special, I think, to a lot of people and to me because you know how long winter is here, and you get to March and it's still basically winter. But the good thing about March and April is this is when the peepers and wood frogs call. So what does that sound like? You probably know what that sounds like. Uh, called chucklers in the background, wood frogs, chuckling, and then peepers. The wood frogs will leave first, and they pretty much stop in March, and then peepers will go even into May. And then it's toads, and then the others in sequence. This is the sound of spring here in New England and in Wisconsin, and you know lots of places. Um, Crucifer is the species name. They have this X on their back. They're very small, as you can see. They're really hard to see. They're actually out there when we were out there with the Tuesday lab and when we were out there with the Thursday lab. They are out there, but they're very hard to find. You just got to get lucky if you see them. Eastern gray tree frog. We actually did get one calling with the lab, the herp lab that went out in the background. You get to fall, temperatures drop down into the 50s during the day. Some of these frogs start calling again for whatever reason. I don't really know why. They're not really breeding. Probably just a side effect of the way they respond to temperature. These are worth mentioning, I think, because they're highly diverse and they're a good example of aposematic coloration. That is, it's advertisement for toxicity. So it does no good to get bitten into if then the predator has no way of remembering the bad experience. So it's much better to be able to look at this thing and say, yeah, you're toxic looking. You want to be toxic looking, especially if you're toxic. Even nice to be toxic looking when you're not toxic. So these are lipophilic. As they dissolve in lipid alkaloids. That's the type of toxin, some of which are deadly to vertebrates. You know, poison dart frogs, for example. What's interesting about these also is some of these are not toxic. They mimic toxic species. So aposematic means warning coloration. Then there's the Rainidae. This is a highly diverse group. They're possibly paraphyletic. That is, you may be including something in there that doesn't really, probably shouldn't be in there, or you might be excluding something. But these are around here, for example, include the bullfrogs and green frogs, which are hard to tell apart. And this is some of our well, here's just the sound of them. In the background, you hear green frogs. Bullfrog. Kind of a coughing sound in the background. Those are the green frogs. They're hard to tell apart. My daughter loves pretty much all animals, wild and otherwise, but there's a little pond near the Riverside Cemetery in Wakefield. We go down there in the spring. There's these enormous bullfrogs. Look at that. She loves catching them, and we play with them there. So but interesting. Look at this picture. That's how you hold a frog, preferably with wet hands, which her hands were wet there. But look at the Euro style there. So the highly modified pelvic bones. You kind of hold, we call it the ice cream cone hold, skinny and then fat at the top. And it really keeps them from getting away from you. Look at those muscular forearms. Males are especially muscular. The problem is they got to mate in wet environments where the female is really slippery and he's constantly getting knocked off by other males. Telling them apart is actually fairly simple. They both have a big tympanum, which is basically the vibratory skin that transmits sound waves. But look at the dorsolateral ridge. The dorsolateral ridge on a bullfrog just kind of does not extend down the body, curves around, whereas it does extend down the body on the green frog. Otherwise, they're really similar looking. They're found in the same environments, and their tadpoles really look similar. And finally, pickerel and wood frogs, very common here. Wood frogs, I mentioned there, the first frogs to breed in Rhode Island during the year. And then the pickerel, which we definitely catch on field trips all the time here, they'll be active until probably up until November, we start getting frost at night, and then they'll hibernate like all these frogs do. Wood frogs will just actually let their bodies freeze during the winter, and they become basically popsicles. But they keep their tissues, the cells don't freeze. The cytosol doesn't freeze because that would be ice crystals and would ruin the cell membranes, but the body is effectively frozen. Pickerel frog, I suspect they're the same way. I don't think they just, I think some of them will actually burrow into mud, but this pickerel frogs this is kind of looks like a leopard frog. But leopard frogs are kind of rare in Rhode Island. What you see here is this yellowish coloration here, and then these little islands of dark spots. Notice again the wet body. They really need wet environments. Otherwise, they're just not going to be out there. So that's it. Wraps up sort of an overview of a sort of taste of the diversity of the Lys amphibia. That's all for now.